What's up YouTube? Cody Bidlow with ATHLETE.X and SprintingWorkouts.com. Today we're going to be talking about weekly training setup and talk about different ways of setting up your week, as well as some of the pluses and minuses that will come with these different ways of approaching your weekly training setup. So before we get into looking at different ways of setting up your week, first I want to talk about some of the factors that are going to go into the ultimate decision that you make about how you set up your week. It's going to be based on somewhat these 5 different factors. So first we have volume, intensity, and density patterns. If your sprint volumes are really high, you can't sustain back-to-back sprint days over multiple weeks without risking burnout or injury. So if you're trying to hit a certain amount of volume and a certain density pattern of, I want to sprint 4 times in a week versus 3 times in a week, that balance of the volume, the intensity of that volume, and the density pattern that you use is going to dictate how much you can actually do within a week, especially when you consider that we don't just want to train for a week, we want to train throughout the year and have repeatable weekly training program setups, so that way we can do something over time and get a benefit from it. But if your volume, intensity, and density patterns are not, built well relative to what you're trying to accomplish, you're kind of doomed from the start. Another thing is injury history. If you have an athlete who has a chronic injury or an acute injury, maybe an injury that has come up in the past and is, rearing its ugly head again, say you have an adductor strain or a hip flexor strain, well, you're probably not going to be able to do crouch starts 3 days in a row in a given week. So you're going to have to modify how you set up your training week if there are injuries that are present or injuries that are flaring up from a previous issue. Then there's the concept of whether or not you're in a competitive season or a competitive week or not. So say you have a meet this week. Well, how you set up your training this week is going to differ greatly compared to a period where you don't have any meets or a week where you don't have any meets. So, you might be able to get away with sprinting 3 to 4 times in one week if you're not competing at that time. But if you're going to run a race on Friday or Saturday, you really cannot expect to get more than 1 or 2 sprint sessions in within that week. So that's another thing you have to consider when setting up your training program. Fourth on the list, we have individual differences in recoverability. So individuals are going to have different levels of recoverability, and their recovery times are going to vary. One athlete might be able to do a session like 6 by 40 meter sprints and then feel great 48 hours later and come back and have a great sprint session. Someone else might need 72 hours. And I personally believe that recoverability will change over time depending on what you're doing, how you're training, your life stressors and things like that. So at this point in time, you may be only able to get in 2 sessions a week of sprinting. That doesn't mean you'll never be able to do 3. It's just that right at this point in time, whatever is going on in your life, in your body, and in your training program, right now you may be limited to only sprinting every 72 hours, but that could change over time. Regardless, there are going to be individual differences between people, and how you recover from a session versus me is going to depend on a lot of factors, some of which we can't control, some of which we can. And then last but not least, we have aggregate stressors. So these are things like a job, school, having kids. An athlete with no kids, no job, no major responsibilities, they can focus all their time and energy on training, recovering, and preparing for the next session. They can, get the exact meal they want because they have all the time in the world to cook it. They can get the right foods because they're not, rushing to go pick up their kid from school or something like that. So if you have a job and you're standing on your feet for 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day at your job, you can't expect to be able to train as much and recover from it effectively as someone who doesn't do that, or someone who isn't staying up all night because they have a newborn baby who's crying, who, wants to get fed and all that stuff. Those aggregate stressors in your life are going to impact how much you're able to accomplish, how much training you're able to do, and you have to consider that when setting up your training program. So I know this is a lot of information, and some of it is a little bit repetitive or redundant, but I just want to show you that there's all kinds of different ways that you can put together a training program, and you're not just limited to high-low 48 hours of recovery. You're not just limited to whatever you did in college. You can get creative, and you can find different ways of putting together training cycles where you get the number of specific sessions you want, you get the number of non-specific sessions you want, you get the number of off days that you want, and by opening your mind a little bit to seeing different ways of setting up your training, this is how you're going to be able to eventually reach your best, because you have to find what works for you, not just what worked for me, what worked for someone else, what worked for your coach in college. You have to find what works for you. So when you're looking at these different ways of setting up training, think about, when I do a sprint day, if I just sprint, how do I feel the next day? Do I feel like I could go sprint again? Do I feel like I could lift? Do I feel like if I did blocks on one day that I can do crouch starts again the next day? Or does my hip bother me? Does my ankle bother me? Something like that. You have to think, how do I feel after an off day? Do I feel good? Do I feel flat? How do I feel after a tempo workout? Do I prefer circuits compared to tempo workouts because it's easier on my body? These are all different things you have to think of when setting up your training. If we look at all these different approaches here, we have everything from 4 sessions a week up to 9 sessions a week. That's a huge difference. If you were to extrapolate that out over multiple months, that's a huge difference in how much training you're getting. Now the thing is, not everybody can handle 9 sessions a week. Maybe you could do 9 sessions for 3 weeks and then you get hurt for 3 weeks, and now you're back to 4.5 sessions a week when you spread that out over the whole period of time when you're training when you were injured. So you have to find the optimal number of sessions for you, the optimal number of sprint sessions, and then build it from there. So it's probably safe for most people to do 3 sessions, but maybe you can get an extra day in there and you can do 4 sessions. So then you think, okay, well, how many different ways can I set up 4 sessions a week? Well, we got 4 sessions here, we got 4 sessions here, we got 4 down here. I'm talking sprint sessions. For you, if you only could do 3, well, we got 3 sprint sessions up here, we got 3 here, we got 2 here. So, start there and think, what can I handle? How do I feel after sprinting? How do I feel after lifting? How do I feel after speed versus blocks versus speed endurance? And then you can start digging into the different ways that you can set up your week. So say I can lift after sprinting, but I really feel pretty fried after I sprint, so I'd prefer to lift the next day. Okay, well then here's different ways we could do that. We could go sprint on Monday and then do a lifting session and a tempo session, or we could do sprinting and then a jump lift session. All right, and then what do we want to do the next day? Well, after sprinting one day and lifting the next and doing tempo after that, probably a little fried, so maybe you take that next day off. Then you're going to feel pretty good, come back for a sprint session. That's the type of thinking that we need to have when we're going about setting up our workouts. Now, when we're looking at specific examples of workouts that would fit into these different paradigms of training, if you are going to sprint back-to-back days, you got to think about, like I said, if I'm going to do blocks on Monday, can I do speed the next day, or are my hips going to bother me? Maybe you can, maybe you can't. When I was doing this 3-3-1 approach here, I only did 3 sets of this 10-meter sled, 20-meter blocks. So I was doing 6 sprints total that day, and then I'd come back for a speed or a speed endurance day the next day. I was able to do that, but after about a month and a half of doing that, I started to have issues. So what you can do in the short term may not be something you can repeat in the long term, and that's another thing you have to consider is, what can I do repeatedly over time for a whole year without getting hurt, without getting sick, without getting burnt out? That's the optimal way to set up your training. It doesn't mean that you never deviate from that. Some weeks you'll have less training. Some weeks you might want to push it a little bit, have an extra day in there of sprinting or an extra lift. That's totally fine. But your foundation, your core that you come back to, that base approach to training, has to be something that's repeatable. Otherwise, you won't repeat it. You'll get hurt. You'll get sick. It'll interrupt your training. You won't improve. You're going to be pissed off, and then you're going to get depressed, and then you're going to quit or something like that. So instead of being like, oh, I have to go to the high frequency approach because that's where I can get 5 sessions in of sprinting, that sounds great until you get hurt. Or until you get burnout. So you got to find the approach that fits your lifestyle, how often you're able to train, your life stressors, how much stress do you have in your life. That's going to impact how much you can train, how much you can sprint versus how many tempo workouts you can do. you have to think about what can I do back to back that's going to work complementary to one another. So like on this 2-1-2-2 approach up here, we got 30-meter flies, where I would probably do those from an upright stance if I was setting it up this way, because then I could come back the next day and do 3x80 and feel okay. But if I did block starts, 6x40 blocks on Monday, I would not be able to do 3x80 the next day because my hip would bother me. Those are the things you have to think about. Similarly, on this Thursday, Friday block, if I did 6 sprints here, I would not be able to do these 40s and lifts the next day. So you got to think about, what am I doing today? How's that going to impact what I want to do tomorrow and the next day, and set up your training accordingly. Other things to consider, if you're going to be including low intensity days in your program, which is probably a good idea for a lot of people, you don't have to do tempo runs. You could do a body weight circuit. Maybe your body deals with that better because that's one less day of running, one less opportunity to get a chronic overuse injury, because in a body weight circuit, you could be doing things in all different directions and hitting movements we never see in sprinting, and that's going to help prevent injury by giving you a wider range of, or a wider array of movement capabilities and ranges of motion that you're competent with, without repeatedly overworking that running motion. Other people might really like tempo runs, and so they do those instead. But those are other ways that you can manipulate your program. And you could do a blend of both. Like here on the 3-3-1, this first block we go sprint, lift, and then circuits, so no running on this day. But the next block of 3 days we have speed endurance, acceleration, lifting, and a tempo run. So you could blend it that way as well. So ultimately, the point of this video is not to tell you, okay, this is objectively the best way to train. One person might say, oh, the high-low approach is the best way to train. Another one might say high frequency is the best way to train. Another one might say sprint, lift, tempo is the best way to go. I have a friend who he ran 10-1 off of lift, jump, run. They lifted on Monday, they jumped Tuesday, and they ran on Wednesday, and then they repeated that, and then they took Sunday off. It's about finding what works for you based on the constraints of your situation, based on what your body's capable of, what you have access to with your schedule. If you got to drive 45 minutes like I do to get from the track to the gym, it's unrealistic, if you have other things you're doing in your life, to be able to fit in a sprint session and a lift session every single time you want to do a high intensity day. Similarly, you might find that you're incapable of putting out the same quality when you lift the same day as you sprint, so you got to separate those days. But then you don't necessarily want to only lift on that day, so that's where bringing in a tempo session after the lift might be a way to, fit things in a more creative way. You don't have to do that. You could just do the typical high-low approach. You could do whatever you did in college. But the key factor here is you have to figure out what works based on what you're capable of within your schedule, what your responsibilities are in your life, what you're able to recover from, what sessions you can do back to back that are complementary to one another, that don't interfere with one another, like not doing blocks back to back because it's going to mess your hips up, or doing too much on Monday so then you can't sprint on Tuesday when that's what you were trying to do, is get back to back sprint days in. You have to think about, how can I set up my training in a way that allows me to get what I want to get done, that I can repeat over time, week after week after week, that I can stay healthy within, and that over time hits the boxes that you want to hit. Now I'm running out of time here, my camera's about to die, but one last thing I want to say is, I know we're talking about a weekly program setup, but you don't have to stick to just training in a 7-day microcycle. You could do a 10-day microcycle, a 14-day microcycle. If you want to get speed endurance, and acceleration in, but you find that your body isn't good with sprinting 3 days a week, you could do a 10-day microcycle, and now you can get those 3 sprints in within 10 days, and boom, now you've got it. So keep in mind that you can get creative with all this stuff. You don't have to stay within a 7-day microcycle, but for the sake of discussion here, that's what we were talking about. So these are a wide, various ways that you can go about setting up your week of training. There's other ways, like I said, we could mix it up to where on this mixed training setup here, instead of going for this last part of the week, we go sprint, lift, sprint. We could go sprint, tempo, sprint, and then finish after that sprint with a lift. Or we could just go sprint, tempo, sprint. We could go sprint, off, sprint. There's all kinds of variations here available. So it's on you to figure out what fits for you, what works for you, what's going to keep you healthy. And then once you figure out what can keep you healthy, then we can go about thinking, okay, what's going to drive development? How much work do we need to do to drive development? But you can never develop if you're not healthy. And the easiest way to hurt your health when it comes to training is doing too much or having too much back-to-back training that is, wearing you out, burning you out, and causing injuries. So when you go about setting up your training program, focus first on what's going to be able to keep you healthy, and then go about adding to it slowly but surely, figuring out what's optimal for you, what's going to drive adaptation, and what's going to get you to improve over time and be able to continue to train over time without getting hurt. So guys, I've droned on long enough. That's it for today. Hope you got something out of this video. Stay tuned for more. I have more content coming. But until next time, this is Cody Bidlow with SprintingWorkouts.com signing off.